we go.
Okay, we got it. Good evening. Welcome to the West Shore Photography Club. This is our normal Wednesday night meeting. This is April the 4th, 2022. Tonight we have a presentation by Jürgen Lobert, and he is going to talk to us about urban night photography. And before we get into that, however, we want to go through some of our recent get a trip updates and talk about some upcoming trips. So I'm going to ask that for Anderson Mill, which we did on Saturday, if Mike Donovan and Norbert Fry, would you give us a little bit of an update on that?
Yes, go ahead, Mike. I'll follow you.
Okay, I'm thinking there were probably between 20 and 25 people there.
Come here, honey. I'm right here. Come on.
I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to mute everybody.
That's a
Okay.
good idea. There we go. I took care of it. Yeah, mute.
Shall we try it again?
Yes.
Yes, try now.
There was between 20 and 25 people, I'm guessing. The mill was full of old stuff, including the people they're photographing. Well, no, not all of them. The light was challenging, which was kind of fun in a way. It was pretty heavy sunlight, and you're inside in this dark area. So it made for some thought-provoking work there.
And Norbert? We can't hear you, Norbert. You need to unmute yourself. Norbert, you're muted.
Yeah, I thought it was a great morning. Harry was on point, and he was telling some great stories about selling the mill and all that. And actually, I saw some of the photographs that some of the members took on Facebook, and it shows a testament to our work, what they were doing. They had some nice photographs. So I'm assuming everyone had a good time, and you know, what can I say? That system is an interesting place to visit, and it's great photographic opportunities there.
And we
So,
may go
anyway.
back. We may go back again in the fall if it seems for some fall color back there too for the outside.
Yeah. Harry was asking me about that. He said, "Do you think you guys will come back?" I said, "Well, I think we probably will."
Yeah, I think we will. So, okay, thanks
Sure
guys
thing.
for that. We do have a trip coming up this coming Saturday to the Kiwanis Lake. And Curtis, can you give us an update on that?
Sure. Yep. I did take a trip to Kiwanis Lake this afternoon, and the birds are real active. Looks like we're going to have a really good outing. They're nest building. I did count about 16 egrets. And on the island of the lake, there's a small island there. There are black-crowned night herons. And I did make a count there, about 6 of those. So I think we're in for a real treat this weekend. Looking forward to it.
And the weather's supposed to be good too. You're going to be getting a notice on this tomorrow. We kind of did this right at the last minute because of the good weather and because the quantity of birds that we have. So that'll be this coming Saturday. It'll be Saturday morning, be about 2 hours there. So, and as a follow-on to tonight's session with Jurgen, next Wednesday night on April the 13th, Karen Cummings is going to be leading with us a trip in Harrisburg at 7:30 in the evening. And we're going to be putting into practice the things that we learned from Jürgen tonight on the session. So that'll be a lot of fun. And you'll be getting a notice on that also. And on Saturday, the 16th, we're going to be going to Hershey Gardens with Elaine. Elaine, are you here? Can you give us an update on that?
Certainly. April and May in the spring are just beautiful months to go to Hershey Gardens. It's when they all of the beautiful tulips and other bulbs are in full bloom. Actually, the peak begins around April 16th or 15th, right about the time that we're going, and continues through mid to late May. So I'm expecting there to be a lot of color. Hershey says that they have 27,000 tulips there at this time of year, which is tremendous, with many different cultivars, many colors in different varieties of tulips in other bulbs. So I'm looking forward to it. The weather looks great so far, if you can trust the long range weather forecast. Of course, that's always subject to change. But so far, it looks like it's going to be partly cloudy, partly sunny, and low chance of rain. So I'm crossing my fingers that that will hold true. But admission is $14 for adults, $13 for seniors over the age of 62. There's lots of places to roam aside from the main garden, which holds all of the tulips. There's the Japanese garden is a wonderful place to visit, and there are other several smaller gardens throughout the 26-acre property. So I'm looking forward to it, and I hope a lot of you can attend.
And I think we also have the butterfly garden that's open for the members and part of that admission. So that's great. Thank you, Elaine. Appreciate that. Keep your eye open because we do have quite a few trips coming up here in the next month or so. It's going to be a very active spring. So just keep your eyes open for that. Tonight's program is Jurgen. He's going to talk to us about urban night photography. I saw his presentation numerous months ago, and it struck me that whenever he was talking about urban photography, we didn't have to take a airplane ride up to Norway to catch the northern lights, or we didn't have to go somewhere out west to get the Milky Way and clear skies. This was stuff we can do right here in Harrisburg. And I just thought this is what we got to do. And Jürgen is from Massachusetts. He's a fine art photographer. He received a PhD in atmospheric chemistry, which he is not going to be reviewing with us tonight, but he has from the university in Germany. He came to the US in 1991. He provides professional instruction for photography in public workshops at the New England School of Photography. So we're really, really happy to have him tonight. Here's what the protocol will be. Everybody will be silenced. Jürgen will be monitoring the chat. So if you have a question, and only if the question is such that he needed to clarify it, he will bring it up. But otherwise, he's going to answer the questions at the end of the session. We will be recording this, as you know, and it'll be on our YouTube channel. It'll be for the members only. So we ask you not to pass this around to all of your buddies and friends. We're also going to be distributing his speaker notes tonight, which is really the narrative, not really the narrative, but it's a narrative of what he's presenting tonight. And that will also be presented to you tomorrow as a handout. And we ask you not to distribute that to anybody else. So that is it. But let's like to welcome Jürgen. Jürgen, you are up, and welcome to the West Shore Photography Club.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. You guys can still hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, good. All right, let's get started. Urban night photography. So why do we do night photography? There's a number of reasons aside from why not, right? So one of the things is that night photos often appear very colorful, and that's because the human eye is actually not optimized to see colors very well at night. We can see light and dark pretty well, but colors not so much. Digital cameras, on the other hand, record the world as it is, and that is often very colorful. So in most of my images, people often ask me, did you saturate that? And I hardly ever use the vibrance or saturation slider. So these colors are really what the camera can see, and unfortunately, we don't see it as much, and that is what makes night photos very intriguing. There was one gentleman, Vincent van Gogh, the famous painter, who realized that and said, I often think that the night is more alive and richly colored than the day. So I don't know if he had superior night vision, but he was spot on with his comment there. Another reason is that night photos are very peaceful and sometimes even a little otherworldly. Because it is dark at night, we are forced to take long exposures. So the water, for example, smooths over to a mirror finish, and that gives it a very serene appearance, and that is another reason. And then, of course, when we take long exposures, we are starting to record time or the effects of time. So clouds start moving across the sky, creating these very dynamic bands, and cars will form really bright streaks in the street. And the stars, of course, appear to form trails in the sky because the Earth keeps rotating. And then, as I mentioned, the water smooths over to a mirror finish and gives you a very nice reflection and shadows, and we'll explore that a little bit later. But the biggest reason for why I find night photography so fascinating is that it is very transformational. So here I am on top of the clock tower in Boston and shooting down a very unique vantage point. Really, you can look down on the city. But in reality, everything is kind of gray and gray. Not very interesting, right? If you go back there at night, that totally transforms into a field of light and shadow and a few colors. Now you can make out the Sakim Bridge here in blue and the Bunker Hill Monument right here. And oh yeah, there's the bridge, Tobin Bridge going across the water. You don't see that during the day, but at night you do see it very nicely. Here's another example. That's Sakim Bridge that I mentioned. You'll see a lot of photos of that tonight, by the way. It is a very popular spot for night photography. But if you go there during the day, again, everything is gray and gray, not something that you find interesting in any way. And you probably wouldn't go there during the day for any reason. But if you go at night, it completely transforms into the spectacle of light and shadow and differently mixed colors. You know? It's a wonderful scenery and rightfully one of the most popular night photography spots that I take my groups to. And then, of course, at night, this is when the stars and the moon and the Milky Way come out, which is a motivation for a lot of people to start night photography. And you actually have some very dark skies not too far away, about an hour away. And I encourage you to take night photography to the next level there as well. But tonight, we're going to talk about cities and urban exploration. So the last aspect of night photography, as I mentioned, because everything smooths over and people disappear when you take long exposures, it is very peaceful and also very relaxing, because when you wait for that 40-minute star trail to finish, you can either engage in conversations with your fellow night photographers, or you can engage in really, really deep philosophical thinking. And if you happen to fall asleep, then your star trail will just get a little longer. No problem there, right? So what is night photography? There is really no official definition. The PSA doesn't have one. The NACCC doesn't have one. Wikipedia says photos taken between dusk and dawn. And then my question is, well, which dusk and which dawn? Because we happen to distinguish three of them. So when the sun goes down below the horizon, that's what we call sunset. And the 45 minutes around that time is what we call the golden hour. And then comes civil twilight for about half an hour after that. And after that, nautical twilight. And the time between civil and nautical twilight is what we call the blue hour, because of deeply blue skies. Not because everything is blue, by the way, and I'll talk about that later. And then afterwards, it gets really dark, astronomical twilight. That's when you would start shooting the Milky Way if you wanted to. And that timing varies by latitude. It gets longer if you go north, and it gets shorter if you get closer to the horizon. And there are apps. I use the app Lunar SoulCal to tell you when the twilight start and end, so you can plan ahead. And just to, I'll give you some examples in a second here. So because there is no definition, I made up my own. For night photography is something that happens outdoors, or at least shows the outdoors, because indoors you can turn off and down the blinds and turn off the lights, but that doesn't mean it's nighttime, right? And any photo that is taken between the civil twilight, so I purposely exclude the civil twilight because it's really too bright. For me, that doesn't count as night photography. So sunset photos are beautiful, the golden hour is great, but it's not night photography. And as a rule of thumb, once you get your exposure times to a little more than a few seconds, that's when you are in the night. So how does that look? Civil twilight, this is the time, the half hour after sunset, and you can still see a little bit of an orange glow here on the horizon from the sunset, right? You still have a very bright sky, but you don't see any stars, for example. And the contrast between the sky and the lights that are starting to switch on is fairly low. So this is a good time to photograph very contrasty scenes that have bright highlights. Then the next half hour, 40 minutes, is what we call nautical twilight. So the sky gets darker, but it is still much lighter where the sun went down, and on the other side it is much darker. And that is when you will start seeing stars that come out one at a time. You see the brightest ones at first, and then more and more. And then in astronomical twilight, that is when we consider the sky to be black. And that is, of course, when you see lots of stars, but you also have to deal with a lot of contrast now, because the bright lights contrast with that dark sky. And that is a little bit the art of doing urban night photography, and we'll talk a lot about that. For the technical aspects, I usually start out with safety. It is nighttime, it is dark, so be safe, right? Don't stumble around, don't trip, don't hurt yourself. And my ethics motto is take only photos, leave only footprints. We don't vandalize, we don't graffiti spray, we don't party. We just get in, take photos, and then we get out. Don't do any stupid stuff. Don't do any illegal stuff. A little trespassing is okay, but don't cut any bolts or locks or fences. But if there is an opening in the fence, by all means, explore, right? Consider that you're not alone, and especially if you go out with a group of people, so don't shine your lights around wildly, because you might be ruining somebody else's photo. And of course, consider that you are being watched, especially if you go into urban settings or inside the city. In most cases, people are just curious. They want to know what you're doing there with a big tripod and everything. And it's a very easy way to strike up a conversation that, yes, you can take photos at night. It's a really cool thing, actually. So here's the equipment that you'll need. You need a camera that is capable of manual settings, and that means exposure time, aperture, ISO, white balance. Those are the 4 parameters that you want to control manually and that you will constantly be changing during the night. For lenses, you'll probably find yourself mostly on the wide angle side, especially inside the city. Anything from 14 to 70 millimeter is really good. 24 to 70 is a wonderful all-purpose lens for that type of night photography. But if you want to get a little more dramatic, take a wider angle lens with you. You will not do too much with long lenses, although I will show you a couple of examples where you can still use those, right? But consider that you are taking long exposure, so if you have a really long lens, any small wind motion or so will probably blur the image. And then to avoid the blurring and the movement of the camera, you'll need a sturdy tripod. And the better that tripod is, the happier you will be, because you will not have problems with blurriness of the images. And then because most cameras, unfortunately, are still limited to 30 seconds, you will need some sort of timer and doubleometer, especially if you want to shoot start sails. So more and more cameras now have longer exposures. I'm very happy that the Nikon C6II, C7II, they now give you up to 15 minutes exposure times. Fuji has done that for a long time, actually, but most cameras are still stuck with 30 seconds. And then if you do buy an intervalometer, don't buy the original brand, Nikon or Canon. They are wicked expensive. So you can get the exact same thing that looks the same, does the same thing for 1/10 of the price, all right? And if you need any suggestions or so, just shoot me an email. I'll send you a link. And then some other stuff that you need. Longer exposures drain batteries much faster than daytime short exposures. So I don't count my batteries in the number of shots that I can take with them. I count my batteries in the number of hours they give me at night. And that is typically around 3 hours or so. Anywhere between 2 and 4 is probably what you'll get out of your camera. So here's a very early photo that I took, one of my best photos early on. The Kennedy Library in Boston. It's a presidential library. So I had these nice leading lines. I went really down low, and then you have that round auditorium and a really interesting glass building back in there. One of my favorite shots from back there. Camera settings. I mentioned it is dark, of course, right? That means not only don't we see very well, we can see our camera very well either. And my biggest advice is something I keep seeing people ignore at first, and then they are sad about ignoring that advice. Learn to handle your camera in darkness. Know how to change exposure time, aperture, ISO, and white balance without having to go through menus and figuring out how to do that. It's very frustrating if you have to do that in darkness because you need a bright flashlight to see your camera. So you can practice that at home, really. Take your camera, sit down on the living room couch, turn off the lights, and start fiddling with your camera until you know what is where, right? Turn off everything with the previous auto because in most cases it won't work very well. So autofocus might actually work in the city if you have a bright light, but I guarantee you that auto white balance won't work, and other things, auto exposure doesn't work either. The preview doesn't work, and so on. Then there is a setting that is called long exposure noise reduction, or LINR, and that is a feature that kicks in automatically on most cameras after a few seconds of exposure time. What it does is it takes, when you take, let's say, a 1 minute photo, the camera shuts down, and the camera takes another 1 minute photo just to record the noise, nothing else, and then it takes the noise and subtracts it from your photo. That is a wonderful feature if you do high ISO photos of the Milky Way, for example, and when you shoot 10, 15-second images. But if you do 1, 2, 4, 8-minute images, you do not want to wait another 1, 2, 4, 8 minutes afterwards. So turn that off because we will also be shooting mostly at very low ISO, which means it's very low noise and we don't really need shoot RAW format, and that becomes really, really important for urban night photography because I mentioned that you have very contrasty scenes. You have super bright lights and you have really deep shadows, and the RAW file will give you much more ability to correct for that and to push the shadows, reduce the highlights, which is not the case with JPEG format. And then use your bulb or remote controller. Oh, and one other good advice is to reduce the screen brightness. Your LCD screen is made for daytime when the sun shines and you need to see what you shot. At night, that is so bright that it not only blinds you, but more importantly, the image might look properly exposed when it's in reality 3 stops underexposed. So if you turn that brightness down by 3 stops, you get a very realistic rendition of the photo that you took. And then display the highlight clipping, what I call the blinkies, and the red, green, blue histogram, not just the white histogram. I'll show you why in a little bit. So now I created an exposure triangle, and those are the 3 parameters that you can set on your camera that determine how bright the photo is going to be: ISO, aperture, and exposure time. And the way I do that here is that you cannot maximize all 3 of them. In reality, you can crank all 3 of them up and blow out everything, right? But in this exposure triangle, you can maximize only 2, and then you have to minimize the 3rd, right? So if we increase the exposure time, the image gets brighter because you collect light for longer, right? If you open the aperture, the image gets brighter because you let in more light at any given time. And if you increase the ISO, then the image gets brighter because the signal is amplified more. What we're going to do in urban night photography, we're going to shoot at low ISO. And I say that is the lowest possible ISO. It doesn't have to be 100, could be 200, maybe even 400. Don't go over that, right? Depending on how dark it is. In most urban settings, I shoot with ISO 100 or even ISO 50. And then I'll tell you in a second why. Then you do a creative choice. What do you want to do with the aperture? Do you want that to be really wide open with very shallow depth of field, or do you want that to be a small aperture where everything is sharp from the foreground to the background? And after you did that, then we basically have to figure out what the exposure time is, and you can play with that. So if you increase the exposure time, that means you have to make the aperture smaller. If you decrease the exposure time, you want the aperture to be wider. And where I want you to be shooting is at longer exposures with a smaller aperture for a number of reasons. So a number of reasons why we shoot at low ISO. One is that your camera is made for ISO 100, sometimes 64, sometimes 200, but most cameras are made for ISO 100. That is what they call the base ISO setting. And that is the only setting where you get the optimum image quality. As soon as you increase the ISO, that quality goes down the drain. And one metric for quality is the dynamic range, which is the number of light levels that your camera can distinguish. And most normal cameras and most modern cameras, it's about 13 to 14 stops or exposure values. That means your camera can distinguish 12,000 levels of light. If you go to ISO 6400 that a lot of people use for dark areas, now that dynamic range goes to 9 exposure values or only 500 values of light. So you lose a lot of information. And for urban night photography, that translates into, can I handle those super bright lights or those really dark shadows, or do they just blur into clipped highlights and blotchy shadows? So, and then of course, also the noise is much lower at low ISO, right? That is the other reason. So at ISO 50, you get a really smooth shadow area here. At ISO 6400, that becomes really, really noisy, and you want to stay away from that. And then, of course, low ISO forces us to take long exposures, and that is what we want to do to capture the element of time, to smooth out those waters and create all the other effects. So now we chose low ISO and creative aperture, and we want to maximize the exposure time. So what you want to do is expose to the right. That is a paradigm that you've probably heard from many daytime photography types as well. That means you want to stretch that histogram out all the way from the left edge, which is pure black, to the right edge, which is pure white, with the shadows, midtones, and highlights in between. And that is basically your dynamic range, the number of light levels that the camera can distinguish, and you want to utilize it all as much as possible. What you don't want to do is overexpose too much, where the pixels crawl up the right edge, or totally underexpose, where the pixels crawl up the left edge, and you leave out a lot of the highlights. And then also one thing to consider with urban night photography is that you get a lot of color. So your white histogram isn't necessarily a good indicator anymore. That is why I suggested to enable the red, green, blue histogram, because it shows you when individual colors are clipping in the highlights as well. So what is highlight clipping? Highlight clipping is basically an area in the image that is completely white. There's no detail left that you can recover. And it is indicated by this blinking of the white lights. Here's an example where that is a little too far. A few pixels clipping is okay, but you want to avoid that in larger areas, right? And that is important where it becomes important to shoot raw format. What you see on the LCD screen is actually a JPEG. It's not the raw file. So if a few pixels clipping, they probably won't show clipping in the raw file when you load that into your software program. And again, use your histogram to gauge how far you can push that exposure. So here's an example. I distinguish between sacrificial highlights and desired highlights. The sacrificial highlights are the centers of the car lights, for example, or street lights. They will clip no matter what you do, and you can see that here. The clipping is here, the street lights and the traffic lights and the lights of the cars. And those are what I call sacrificial highlights. You sacrifice them. We will not be able to properly expose for them, because then everything else would be black, right? The desired highlights, what I exposed for here is all of these marquees down the street in Hsinchu, Taiwan here. And that is what I found interesting. That is what I exposed for. That is what I did not want to clip. And here's another example that is also taken in Singapore. I exposed for the lovely highlights on the water here, and you can see that they're a little brighter right in the middle. So I pushed the exposure as much as I could before they started to clip. But of course, there are a few really bright lights up here, and here the marquee, and over there, that little advertisement. They're clipping. Those are my sacrificial highlights. And those lights on the water, the reflections and the blue lights under the bridge, that is what makes the photo. That is the desired highlight. That is what you need to expose for, and that you need to prevent from clipping. And the only way you can do that is really look at the image, look at your histogram, how many blinking pixels do you have, minimize those, right? So let's dive into urban night photography. What and where can we shoot? And the answer is just about anywhere. So here is again, that's a King Bridge. I went underneath from the other side this time. It's a beautiful spectacle of lights and shadows and differently colored lights. Wonderful to experience at night. And of course, one logical thing to do if you are near a city is to shoot a skyline. Go somewhere, preferably across the water if you have some water there. Find the high rises, so the most interesting part of the city. This is Boston, Massachusetts, my hometown here, my stomping grounds where I do most of the shooting. On the right, you see the Sakim Bridge. On the left, you see the high rises, and I include a little bit of a crescent moon there too. This is a different aspect, but it's also Boston, but that is the one example where I took along a really long lens, 500 millimeters actually, and I zoomed in to compress the view and zoom in on that bridge, the Tobin Bridge going into the city, and the traffic appears to be disappearing between those two pillars. Interesting viewpoint. It's an elevated park outside of the city. Here is San Diego, California. And this is much closer to your stomping grounds, Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. It has two converging rivers. That's always a good thing to shoot, right? And downtown looks pretty interesting as well. And here is Portland, Oregon, with some lovely light reflections on the water. And finally, Singapore. So despite what Joe told you that you don't have to go anywhere, you don't have to go anywhere. But if you happen to go there, definitely take your camera along, because some of those cities have wonderful skylines to shoot. And of course, New York City, which is pretty close to me. That's always a wonderful place to shoot. This was a very overcast night. It was actually drizzling that night. And I took this panorama of a few images. And what I liked about this are the colored reflections on the very, very low clouds. There's a lot of light coming from that city. This is, once you go into the city, then get away from the panoramas. In the city, of course, you can always find some interesting architecture. And this is Boston Seaport, a fairly new building, which looks like a Jenga building where they kind of accidentally made the levels crooked, but of course that was all on purpose. This is a night that I spent on the High Line in New York, and my theme for the night was no straight lines. So all of my images from that night are crooked in one way or another. Here I actually took a fisheye with me. Fisheye in architecture is not something you're supposed to use, so break the rules, take your fisheye, and do just that. It's really fun. This is Boston again. The green roof is an entry to the subway and a fancy illuminated banker's building in the background. Connecticut, that's Hartford, the Science Center in Hartford. Really cool architecture with that overlapping roof. And this is a building, a Gehry building actually, being built in Chicago. It was being built in 2020. That was my last trip before the pandemic actually. And here is Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is the Kresge Library. It looks like a big buck coming right at you. And then if you get bored of architecture, start looking up. You'll find some interesting things. And I have to warn you that I have a little thing for bucket lifts, raised platforms, hydraulic lifts, whatever you call them. I like them. I always put them in. Whenever I look up, there seems to be a hydraulic lift around. And the moon also. Really cool, right? But if you point straight up between two high-rises, you can find some really unique views. And it doesn't matter if it's overcast or if you see some stars there. It's always fairly interesting. We happen to have an art installation at Boston. They spun this netting right across the major highway going through the city, and it was kind of undulating in the wind, very mesmerizing to shoot and to simply watch, really. And here's a photo that a friend of mine took, Derek Moore, in one of the most successful combinations. He also used a fisheye for that. So really interesting things that you can do with a fisheye in the city. Another one of my hobbies is abandoned stuff. urban exploration, decay. It's wonderful to shoot. And notice that this train station is abandoned, but the train tracks are not. And there happened to be a train coming by, and that's what created those white streaks. Here is a house that was completely burned out that I found, and I'll show you later in the editing section how I took that. But I thought that looked really interesting, especially with those cloud streaks right above. You know, there's a very still moment, that burned out dead house, and something very alive coming at you in the sky. A nice dichotomy there. Here's an old pier in Boston, and somebody obviously tried to set that on fire. And in order to have it not be all black, I actually used a flashlight to illuminate the foreground, a little bit of light painting there. And you see that we have quite a few of those old dilapidated piers here. It's one of my favorite objects to shoot in the city. Here's an abandoned house, a small town near me. It looked cool. I had to work a little bit on the colors, but it was nice with the starry sky above. And then you can photograph people at night. Just be very careful how you announce that, okay? Don't go posting on Facebook, I'm going to go out tonight shooting people. That might be mistaken by some, all right? So be careful. But here's a lovely model. She was modeling a desk that my sister-in-law made, actually, and I put her in front of that fountain. I thought that was a cool setting. Here's a selfie that I took at a very old town in Germany. And if you have a subway or you get to go into a subway, that's a really cool thing to shoot, where you have people standing really still when right when the train comes zipping in. So they're not moving yet because they don't know where the door is going to be. So they're standing still. You have to capture that moment with a half second or so. It's a cool effect. But most people, of course, move, and you can take advantage of that and make that child come out of the time portal, it was, I believe, or something like that. And if you go to a temple, you'll never find that being empty, so embrace it. One advice my brother taught me is, if you can't avoid it, make it a feature, right? So embrace those people, make them blur. It looks kind of ghostly and very interesting. Coming back to the transformational character of night photography, I always boldly claim that you can even make garbage look good at night, and here's my example. I was walking back from one of my early photo shoots back to the car, and I look at that corner and say, hey, that might look interesting. I set up my camera, took a 5-minute photo, and I didn't even notice that the corner was spray painted blue until I saw the photo come up on the LCD screen. Remember, our eyes are not made to see colors at night, you know, and that was a really dark corner. The only question I had, parking permit, who wants to park in that corner? Yeah, okay. Now, you don't have to go anywhere fancy, to Joe's point, right? You do not have to go to Singapore. This is actually the street right outside of my house here. So to the left here, that's my driveway. And so I just stepped out of my house, and I liked how that single street light that we have on the road illuminated that corner. So I just took that. This is the view out of my backyard. I happen to live on the Charles River, which is nice, but it was frozen over, and you can even do star trails there. And this is a town nearby. The town itself was pretty boring, but it had this church with those really beautiful green steeples. So I took a photo of that and zoomed in to 70 millimeter. And then when I was driving home from that spot, I looked over my shoulder and I saw this really bright tree. So I stopped and walked over there, and I saw that the yellow sodium vapor light, the street light, was illuminating that set of trees and creating that really wonderful reflection on the pond. So that was a good urban night photo that I thought. And then, of course, you might find when you roam around, especially in those dingy little towns, you might find some train tracks, and it creates a conundrum. Where do those train tracks go? And the answer is, this one doesn't go anywhere because it's cut off, but that one here might go somewhere, and you see the light around the corner. So go exploring, or don't go exploring and just capture the moment and make it look interesting. And here's a bike path along the Cape Cod Canal. And again, I liked how the light came up from behind it with all those poles on the left side being a leading line, drawing my eye in. Now, if I don't know if you guys get any fog where you live. Unfortunately, we don't get much fog here. I really miss the nights in Germany where you can literally not see for 50 yards. But occasionally we do have a foggy night, and I encourage you, take your camera and go out. It's really cool because the fog diffuses those super bright lights. Remember, I made those sacrificial lights, like sacrificial highlights, right? But in the fog, they actually become very desired because you see that blooming around them, and that looks really, really cool. And you combine that with some cross streaks to get a very dynamic effect cutting through the silent night. And even the parking lot of a grocery store looks interesting then. That's exactly what that is. You see a little bit of water on the pavement, but then the bright lights diffusing and just giving you a sort of a ghostly scenery, right? And really, that's a parking lot of a grocery store, nothing else. That's a town in upstate New York that I was visiting for a conference, so I took my camera out. Also, a little bit of fog there. Creating some nice visual effects. And finally, this is 5 minutes from me here, just a side road. I drove by in a foggy night. I was actually driving home, and I saw that single light in the really dark street, so I stopped naturally to take a photo of that. And since we're talking about fog and water and inclement weather, if you have a rain event and you can time it to go out after the rain, that is a really cool time to do urban night photography. When it rains, it's difficult to take photos because the raindrops go on your lens and then you get these big splotches on the photo. You don't want to do that. But when the rain stops, really take your photo out and go out. You get these beautiful reflections of lights. And it becomes all about these reflections, really. Here's a drizzly night in Providence. And then finally, this is Boston, the big plaza in front of City Hall. So I literally set my camera as low as I could. I spread the legs all the way out, and the camera was maybe 6 inches off the ground or so, right in the middle of the puddle, and then shooting that scenery. Very dramatic effect for that. And then the other thing you can find if you have a water surface, shadows, and you need to learn to find those shadows, but they are really, really cool. So whenever you have a really bright light in the background and a tree or a fence or a pole in front of it, you start seeing these really cool patterns and shadows on the water. And that can create a nice repeated pattern image. Or just really draw your attention to those shadows, and you kind of have to learn to do that because when what your eyes are seeing is an instant snapshot, right? So the water is ripply and it's obscuring those shadows. So you kind of have to walk along the waterfront, look at the bright lights. Where is that? And you start seeing those shadows, and then when you take the long exposure, the water smooths out, and those shadows become really, really stark, and they come right at you because the light is coming at you, right? It's a perspective. And this industrial building here seems to be saying, hey, come over here. We're not all that bad. Ignore the fumes. Cool effect. Oh, and another effect of night photography, you see those starbursts, right? So if you shoot at small apertures, f11, f16, those point lights, they create really beautiful starbursts. And then I encourage you to revisit. So don't just go out once next week with your group. Go again and again and again, and go visit the same spots over and over again. So here is part of the Boston Skyline, one of the bridges going over the Charles River. I visited that in 2015 when we had really, really low clouds, almost foggy. You can see that the clouds are already hitting that high-rise here, right? And then I went back a couple, 3 years later, and that same scenery looked very, very different on an almost clear night. And by then, they had also installed blue lights under the bridge, which improves the bridge very much so, I must say. And then I went back again, and it was foggy again, or cloudy at least, but I gave it a different take. It's a much more high-key image than the other one. So I was in the mood for something much, much brighter, and I purposely started clipping some of those bright reflections here. And that also happened because the water was starting to freeze over. So that doesn't help. And that's is yet another rendition of that same bridge, but I emphasized my favorite constellation in the sky, the Orion constellation. So I just wanted to show that, yep, you can see stars over the city. So let's talk a little bit about light sources and colors, and especially white balance. So if you go into the city, you have all sorts of different colored lights, right? There are yellow sodium vapor lights, the old kind of street lights. There are bluish green mercury vapor lights, which are usually used in industrial installations. But in modern times, you have all sorts of LED lights, of course, and they can have any color under the sun, right? So now the question becomes, what is the right white balance? And it also, the different colors gave me an epiphany when I started doing night photography. So I saw this boat, I thought that was interesting, the moon right above it and the clouds moving across. So I set up my camera, I estimated an exposure time of 1 minute, and that was spot on. The clouds were diffusing the moon a little bit, so it wasn't clipping too much. And when that photo came up on the LCD, I asked myself, why is that all yellow? It's a brown wooden boat with white paint chipping off. Why is it all yellow? And then the epiphany occurred, and I realized, oh yeah, there is a bright yellow sodium vapor light right behind me, and it makes the foreground all yellow. The clouds are far away, so they're still neutral, nice and gray as they are supposed to be, right? But the boat was yellow, and then it dawned on me that, that's very interesting. What I saw was a brown boat with white paint chipping off, something like this, right? Because we know wood is brown, and, well, we recognize white paint as white, right? But it's not what the camera does. The camera records what it sees, what there actually is, and that is a bright yellow sodium vapor streetlight, right? So cameras don't filter. Our brain filters information. Our brain tells me, oh yeah, brown boat, white paint chipping off, and that's what we think we see, but we don't really. So cameras don't filter, and in contrast to the brain, and that is what makes many of those night photos so unusually colorful that we don't expect. So here's a spectrum of color temperature. And the color temperature goes from orange to blue. And what we know to be daylight is about 5,500 Kelvin. That is what we consider to be neutral white, what the brain considers to be neutral white, right? And then if you go to higher Kelvin numbers, 10,000, that is a really clear, cool poleward sky. And if you go to 1,000, that is a candlelight or the yellow sodium vapor lights, really, right? Now, this is why auto white balance no longer works, because auto white balance is made for 5,500 daytime color temperature, give or take a little bit depending on shadow or clouds, right? But it can't handle these extreme blue and yellow lights, and that is why auto white balance will fail at night, guaranteed. So what auto white balance tries to do is to balance or counter the actual color temperature. So if your color temperature is 2,000 really warm to 10,000 really cool, the white balance tries to do the opposite. So if you dial it down to 2,500, that's what most cameras give you as the bottom setting, it makes the image cooler. It tries to balance the warm, right? And if you crank it up to 10,000, it makes the image warmer. It balances the cold. And this is the white balance or the color temperature in the red, green, blue color space. And if that looks familiar, that's the two sliders that you have in Lightroom and Camera Raw. You have one that's called temp, and that is your color temperature, which goes from orange to blue. And the other one is called tint, and that goes from purple to green. And between those two sliders, you can reach any point in that RGB space that you want by simply adjusting them as you need. And here's why it is important to choose a white balance that is correct at night. Here's an example, and that is from 2013. I just had started night photography. I was inexperienced, and I forgot to set the proper white balance. So here I took a scenery of a blue pillar. It's an art installation, and this is a gray concrete bridge with a yellow sodium vapor light. And the camera told me this is properly exposed, pushed all the way out, and no highlights clipping, right? Except for that street light. But the blue isn't really blue, and the concrete is all yellow. So after I corrected for that in post-processing, now the concrete is more neutral gray, and the blue is really blue, not purplish, right? But look what happened. The blue lights are clipping, and quite a few of those, and that is too much. And that is the white strip here. So the white strip should have really given it away for me, but I was inexperienced. I didn't realize that. I was really just going by histogram. And having the wrong white balance means you can clip individual colors. In this case, it is the red color. In my example here, it was the blue color. You can clip individual colors, and there is no recovery from that. Once they're gone, they're gone. If you shoot raw file or not, doesn't matter. So you have a lot of latitude to adjust the white balance afterwards, of course, because all of the data are there in the raw file. But if you clip any of those colored lights, they're gone, right? So make the LCD screen look like what you're looking at. Does that image that I just took, does that look like what I'm looking at? Or is it all blue, or is it all yellow? And then adjust it as you need it. And there's really no good rule for that. The only suggestion I can make is to use the manual Kelvin scale, because it is the finest tuning you can do for the white balance. And one exacerbating fact is that white balance changes dramatically during civil and nautical twilight. So after the sun goes down below the horizon, white balance needs to go way up because the atmosphere cools down dramatically, and that is the blue hour. Blue hour means cool light, and that is why we need to crank the white balance up. And then after, at the end of nautical twilight, the white balance drops way, way down and settles in somewhere around 3,500 or so. And then in the city, of course, it mostly depends on whatever ambient lights there are around you, okay? So you have these yellow sodium vapor lights, 2700 Kelvin, and 3000 is maybe a good starting point. During civil and nautical twilight, it will affect you, so you will have to accommodate that. But once you get past that, the lights around you will determine what the white balance is, the best white balance is to be used. Colors. Now that we have white balance figured out, we can make concrete look neutral gray, right? And that's what I did in here. And the colors that you see, that is really how those buildings look like. That art museum is yellow, and the hotel high-rise and casino is blue, and the Helix Bridge on the left is red. And those are very desired lights because it's a very colorful scenery, right? So, and sometimes it is very desired. Sometimes color is not so desired. So here's an example where there is a really bright yellow sodium vapor light on the right and a really green neon light on the left. And if you set the white balance on the left, you get fairly neutral gray here, but the right side is kind of purplish, icky, right? If you set the white balance to the right, then that gives you the neutral appearance, but the neon light gets equally green, right? And then you can set the white balance in the middle, get a little bit of both. And what I do with sceneries like that is I simply convert them to black and white. Now, the color information is not interesting, and it doesn't add to what I want to show you. So I'll just take that information out and make it black and white. So black and white does have its place in night photography. Don't shy away from that. And now what you see is what I wanted to show you, a building where the facade is crumbling and the metal is rusting and there's graffiti spray on it. So that is what I really wanted to show you here. And somebody asked, photographing abandoned buildings at night, is that safe? And yes, if it's right in the city, right in front of you, you can just walk up to it and photograph it. If you find something somewhere else, follow your gut instinct. If you don't feel safe, don't go inside or so, right? But you can still photograph abandoned buildings from the outside, sometimes over the fence if they're fenced in or so. You know, you can exclude the fence somehow, make it appear like you are there, even though the fence keeps you away from it. So follow your gut instincts, and again, don't do anything illegal, don't do anything stupid. A little trespassing might be okay. Tips and tricks. A few tricks that make night photography a little easier. So we decided to shoot at ISO 100 or low ISO, right? And choose the aperture creatively or to balance the light situation. But we still haven't figured out what the time is, the exposure time, right? Now, to remind you, an exposure stop is twice the light or half the light. So if I go from 1 minute to 2 minutes, I get twice the light. If I go from 1 minute to 30 seconds, I get half the light, right? And likewise, ISO, if I go from ISO 100 to 200, it gets twice as bright. Or ISO 100 to ISO 50, it gets half as bright. And you can trade off exposure time and ISO to figure out what your exposure time is supposed to be. Because 1 minute exposure time at ISO 100 is the same brightness as 1 second at ISO 6400. So if you go from ISO 100 to 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, that's 6 exposure stops, right? If you go from 1 minute to 30 seconds, 15, 8, 4, 2, 1 second, that's also 6 stops. So 1 second at 6400 ISO is the same brightness as 1 minute at ISO 100. So now what you do is you set your camera to 6400 ISO temporarily just to figure out the exposure, right? And then you figure out how many seconds do I need for the proper exposure. And the proper exposure means we want to stretch that dynamic range as much as possible without clipping anything except for the sacrificial highlights, right? Just the street lights. And that is trial and error. Start with 1 second. Too dark. Double it. 2 seconds. Yeah, it's still too dark. Double it again. 4 seconds. Now it's a little too bright. Too much clipping. So 3 seconds would have been your proper exposure, right? And that just cost me about 10 seconds of time to figure out. Now that you know 3 seconds, you set your camera back to ISO 100, and 3 seconds becomes 3 minutes, right? Here's an example. I chose f16 for my creative aperture because I wanted everything sharp from foreground to background, but I also wanted to get these beautiful starbursts, and the smaller aperture gives you really a nice starburst, right? And at ISO 6400, I figured out 2 seconds is the proper exposure time. These reflections here on the water, that is what I exposed for. I did not want to clip those, right? What I do sacrifice are the insides of the lights, of course, and the marquee here, and that construction building here. And then I go from from ISO 6400 back to ISO 100, and the 2 seconds becomes 2 minutes. Beautiful smooth water. It was a windstill night, right? And the clouds are moving across the sky. That is exactly what I wanted. And then I cropped it, gave it a little dehaze and clarity, and this is the end result, right? That is my scenery. So ISO 6400, how many seconds do I need? And then go back to ISO 100, and the seconds becomes minutes. Just don't forget to set your camera back to ISO 100, because if you shoot 2 or 4 minutes in ISO 6400, it'll kind of look like that, right? Not that that ever happens to me. So here's an example where I took an 8-minute photo. Thank you very much. I did light painting, and the embarrassing thing was that somebody helped me. And then you come back to your camera and you have 2 reactions, the mental reaction and the physical reaction. And the mental reaction is, what the hell is wrong with my camera? And then the physical reaction is, you idiot. You forgot to set the ISO down to 100, right? So this is how it was supposed to look, with 8-minute star trails in the sky, light painted inside. So I had to do it again. But it was very embarrassing because the other person wasted 8 minutes too. All right, so adjust your parameters. Since we're talking about trading off ISO and exposure time and aperture. Keep the brightness the same, right? So if your high ISO preview tells you at ISO 100 and F11 you need 8 seconds or 8 minutes at low ISO, and that is too long for you, then you can cut that down, right? You can go to ISO 200, twice the brightness. That means 8 minutes becomes 4 minutes. Or you can go to ISO 400, cut it down again, it becomes 2 minutes. Or you can go from F11 to F8 for 4 minutes, or to F5.6 for 2 minutes, Or you can combine it, go down to f8 and up to ISO 200, also for 2 minutes, and so on. Trade that off, and while you do that, learn to think in full stops, because it makes life so much easier if you do that. I don't bother with 25 seconds or 13 seconds. I go 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, because my brain processes that much, much quicker, right? 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, that's full stops. ISO 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, that's full stops. And for the aperture, unfortunately, they're odd numbers. You have to learn them: 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, right? Get used to that. And then you can trade it off. And I set my camera to half stop intervals, not 1/3. So click, click is one stop, and click, click is another stop. So I can quickly trade off the ISO with the exposure time or the aperture. And I can do that without looking at my camera, because I sat in my living room and figured out how to do that in complete darkness. You can do that too. Another tip, avoiding flares. Flares are unwanted reflections, which are usually created by a bright light hitting the front element of your lens. And here's a really bad example of a Sigma lens that I had. So here's this really bright street light, and you see it creates a flare that goes all the way into space, and then you see this heptagonal blotch here and another blotch here. So really bad flares, right? Here's another example at small aperture, the Manhattan Bridge, I think it is in New York. It creates these little effects on the water. And the way you can avoid that is by, first of all, use your lens shade. Bring that. Don't think that you don't need that at night because there's no sunshine, but there are really bright streetlights, right? And then another thing you can do is you can shade it with your own body. So here's an example. I had a wide angle lens on my camera. I didn't want to bother changing that. I wanted to shoot that industrial installation here. And there's this really, really bright street light. So I'm leaning into the composition, and I can see the shadow of my head hitting the lens. So I'm basically blocking that bright light out and preventing it from creating flares. And then after straightening it out and cropping it, this is what I wanted to shoot, right? That's what I saw, and that's what I wanted to shoot. And I prevented the flares by shading the light with my body. And one other thing to consider, if you have a DSLR, you can catch light through the viewfinder. If you have a really bright street light behind you, it goes through the viewfinder, goes around the mirror that is folded up, and creates flares on the sensor. And to avoid that, you can put that little cap over the viewfinder, or if you are like me and you lose that after 2 weeks, you can just take a strip of sticky tape or so and stick that over. Or if you have a cap or a scarf or whatever, drape that over it. It'll all work out. And of course, if you have a mirrorless camera, you don't need that. And then using filters, I usually always discourage people from having filters on their lenses. So if you have a skylight or a UV light filter, take those off, because they are just another surface to create flares and reflections. So, and they might take away some of the light that you don't really have at night. So take those filters off. But there are actually occasions where you can use an ND filter, making it even darker than it already is, right? So if you have really bright lights, they sometimes prevent you from taking long exposures and smoothing out the water. So this is the image that I showed you before, the Singapore line, when we talked about desired highlights, right? Those are the desired highlights, but you see that the water is still pretty ripply. And that's because I didn't get more than 10 seconds of exposure out of this. The scenery was so bright. What I really would have liked to have is some smooth water with really smooth reflections. And the way to get that is with an ND filter. So here I am in the middle of Chicago, and I was shooting at ISO 50, that's the lowest ISO setting I have on my camera, and f22, the smallest aperture my lens gave me. And I didn't get beyond 15 seconds of exposure time. So what I did was I put a freeze-stop ND filter on. That means you are now capturing freeze-stops less light. And that means I could go back to ISO 100, and I could shoot at f16 for the best starburst in 30 seconds, twice the exposure time. And if I had stuck to ISO 50 and f22, I could have pushed that to 2 minutes, right? Exposure time. So you can play with that. And here's another example where I did that technique with a 3-stop ND filter. Really, really bright lights, right, shining on the water, and that was blowing out. So I put the filter on to capture that without blowing out the desired highlights, those lights on the water. So I mentioned one of the most intriguing aspects of night photography is the element of time, or the effect of time that we can capture. Everybody has done this, right? Taken a photo of a waterfall at a half second or so. And there is something really about silky smooth water. We like it, and it's just a wonderful thing to do. So how long do you need to expose to smooth out the water? And the answer is it depends, mostly on how windy it is. If it's totally wind still, you might get really smooth waters with 10 seconds, but if it's really windy, you might get okay smoothness with 4 minutes, right? So it depends a little bit. Here's an example where I started out with 2 seconds, very ripply water. That is pretty much how you see it with your human eye. 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, and 4 minutes. That's how far I pushed it. So there was quite a bit of wind going on, right? But you see it's not perfectly smooth, but it is reasonably smooth. And the smoother it gets, the sharper those shadows become on the water, right? So 2 seconds all the way to 4 minutes. And also notice when I went to 4 minutes, I had to clamp down on the aperture. So f11, f16, f22, they create those really nice starbursts that I mentioned. That's another one of those neat effects. And then you can record time, or the effect of time. Something we wouldn't see is that little swirl on the water here. So that is basically water hitting an obstruction and then going in circles. That looks really cool if you have leaves floating on the water, for example. And as I mentioned, you get really nice, sharp shadows on the water if you do that. Capturing motion, the water, beautiful effects. Capturing motion through car trails. I mentioned that before. I showed you that image before. The red lights are the tail lights going into the city, and white lights are coming out of the city. My apologies. I start losing my voice after a while. Here's an underpass in Boston, and I was waiting until a taxi came by. The taxi had an advertisement on top. That is what created that blue streak there. And here's Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the car trails are really just emphasizing the curves of the streets and the water. And this is an evening where I was walking back from doing a little urban exploration. And I saw these reflections on the pavement on these patches here. And I thought that might look good with the moonlight reflecting on it. I set up my camera, took a 15-second exposure, and there was a car coming by from behind. So that was a little serendipity, nothing that I was counting on, but it actually made a nice effect, right? It gave you a nice leading line going in, and then you go up to explore the sky. And if you really want to capture motion, go visit a fair. That is a really cool place to capture moving parts and moving people. You know, you see the ghostly people in the foreground. I was exposing for about 30 seconds or so. And all of the rides are moving, of course. And the most surprising effect was that nobody really cared about me being there with a huge tripod. That seemed to be totally normal. Go figure. And then capturing motion, we can do that with the clouds too, of course. And there are two scenarios: when the clouds are moving side to side, which gives you a more serene view, or when they're coming right at you, which is a little more dynamic in appearance. And it depends on how fast the clouds are moving, how much wind there is. So the first image was a 30-second image with a wind going fairly fast. This image is actually a 4-minute photo, and the clouds are barely moving. So watch how fast they're moving and then figure out how long you have to expose to get a decent motion effect out of it. It look very dynamic behind the buildings. And in terms of capturing time, longest time is not always the best. I showed you some examples for smoothing water. The longer, the better for the smoothing, right? But in terms of cloud movement, when you have a very short exposure, they are puffy, just the way you see them in the sky. And then the longer you go, the more they get diffused. And at 6 minutes here, it becomes almost a complete continuous band in the sky, continuous surface in the sky. So the longest time is not necessarily the best, and I probably like the 40 seconds and 80 seconds best here because they have enough texture in the sky to make it look interesting, but smooth enough to give you that effect of time, right? So here's a comparison, very short, very long, and in the middle is the one that I probably like the best. Having said that, if you do have completely soft-in skies, that can look really cool too, because you can capture what I call luminous skies, all of the lights from the city or from the towns reflecting on the clouds, especially if they are really low. And you will see different colors because some yellow lights, some bluish lights, and that can look very, very beautiful, all right? So go for it and experiment. And I always tell people, if you're unsure how long to expose, take a few exposures, 3 or 4, right? 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes. And of course, you have to adjust the ISO and the aperture accordingly to have the same brightness in each photo. And then in post-processing, look at it and which one do I like best, right? And if you do that often enough, you get a feeling for it and you can tell how long do I need to expose for that. Somebody asked if I have a preference for using internal over external intervalometer, Edmund. The answer is very definitely internal if it is easy to use. So my Nikon C6 II can go up to 15 minutes, and I use that. I no longer need an intervalometer for that one. The advantage of an external intervalometer is that it is fairly easy to use, much easier than the built-in intervalometers, especially if you do star trails. The disadvantage is that you have something dangling from your camera and that can move in the wind. You have to tie it down. It can plop out, and if you shove it into your camera, you might break the contacts. I've done that 3 times, not once, not twice, but 3 times. So I was glad when I was able to get rid of the intervalometer. And then on my other cameras, I have an intervalometer that is really, really small. I don't know if you can see that. Right here, there's a really small plug-in that goes and that sits inside of the L bracket that I use, so it doesn't dangle, and it's something that I can control with my cell phone. So I have an app, and I can punch in 4 minutes, go. So I do that. Now, I showed you one example where you can actually see stars, and you can do star trails in the city. Most people, when you roll around the city, you just go from point A to point B. You don't bother looking up, but that is really all you need to do. You have to look up. And look, there's another bucket lift. Whenever I look up, there's a bucket lift. I don't know why. And this is taken on Boylston Street, which is the main shopping street in Boston. So that's one of the brightest streets. And the secret here is that you have to zoom past the street lights. So cut the street lights out because that's the really bright part. And once you zoom past it, you can take star trails in the city. Your exposures might be really short, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, because it is so bright. And you have to take 180 photos to get a decent star trail, but you can do star trails in the city. And yeah, even in New York City. So here's Queens, and you can see how the star trails fade out to the left because the city is getting so bright, right? But I famously claimed that if you can do star trails over Manhattan, you can do them anywhere in the world. And this is what I did. I chose F11 because I wanted the foreground rocks be sharp and the city be sharp. So for the depth of field, right, creates nice starbursts. And so you see less stars at F11. But I still got to 2-minute exposure time. So I stacked about 10 or so for them together and a 20-minute star trail. And then I would love to tell you how to shoot meteors in the city, and I can show you here that it is possible to do that. But unfortunately, that is really just dumb luck. You may or may not experience it. There was a really bright one streaking right through an Earth grazer. I was shooting at low ISO, long exposure time, but it was bright enough to go right through the image, right? And yeah, it is a matter of luck. I've been witnessing many, many meteors over the city, saw them with my own eyes, but of course the camera was shooting in the other direction, right? So these two examples, I was lucky enough to catch them in my short exposures in the city. And where do you go? Use vantage points, and I'll start from the bottom and go higher and higher. So go down low and go below the bridges, for example. So here's one of the main highways going into Boston, and underneath have this wonderful sweeping line and showcasing the Sakim Bridge. Here's another one very close by. On the left is the highway ramp. On the right is a pedestrian bridge. And that made a nice photo, a nice composition to showcase the Sakim. But then I looked underneath on the right. Well, how does it look underneath there? Well, let's go underneath then and take a look. And there it is, right? Beautiful mixed colors, a little blue, a little yellow, some wonderful shadows coming from the right, and totally peaceful because nobody is there other than you. I'm still very close to the ground, 12 inches off the ground or so, shooting almost eye to eye with these big boulders. And again, that's a nice sweeping leading line to go to the main object, which is the bridge. Here I am in a parking garage, and that I think was abandoned. Nobody used it, and it's a setup and a really wide angle lens, 14 millimeters. Giving a different view. Nobody looks up at that ceiling, you know. So I was surprised. Oh yeah, it's hollow. Cool, yeah. To reduce the weight, of course, it makes sense. Nobody thinks about that. Now I'm at about almost 2 feet off the ground. There's a rail track going into and out of Boston across the Charles River. The funny part is this was a meetup, and you see two of my meetup members up here shooting back down where I was. And the very first time I was on that bridge, I actually told people, hey, there's a cool abandoned train track. Let's go down there and shoot it. And not 1 minute later, a train came out of there with a big bright light on. Everybody was laughing at me. And in fairness, the train was so slow you could have walked in front of it. But anyway, it's not an abandoned track. So always look at how shiny the tracks are. If they are really shiny, they're still being used. If they're all rusty, they're probably not being used. But I set my camera up, always ready to immediately grab it if the train comes. Now we're a few feet off the ground, looking at the waterfront, and that is something you do wherever you walk along a river or so. Find a good vantage point, some nice reflections in the water, smooth waters, looks good. And then you can find unique angles. Here's a bridge that goes up, and I thought these rivets looked pretty interesting, so I made them a feature. And here I am zooming in to see that rail going down below in a nice sweeping line. So always find a good composition. Now going up a little higher, shooting from bridges is a good thing to do, of course, because they are slightly elevated, so you can show that you are above everything else. Here's that abandoned train track from the other side that I just showed you. So the other image was taken right down here, shooting along the tracks. And that is Boston with a little bit of moonlight here on the upper right, a little bit of city light. And I was adding the light on this bridge because it's very, very dark. I used my flashlight, shining it from the top down. And then if you go to hotels, that is an awesome vantage point, but it might be a little cumbersome to squeeze the camera out of a tiny little window, or in most cases, you have to shoot through the window. And if you do that, here's a trick. They usually have curtains. Make that curtain and fold it behind you and behind the camera. That way you cut out the reflections from inside. Turn off the light inside the room also. And now you can put the camera lens right against the wall, against the glass, and shoot the scenery without any reflections. And if you have a friend who works in one of the high rises in your city, then take advantage of his invitation, take your camera, and take a shot out. And this is from a Ferris wheel that the Singapore Flyer, which is the same Ferris wheel as London or London Eye, and it is constantly moving. So this is an example where I deviate from my advice to shoot at low ISO because the thing is constantly moving. I had to crank it up to 6400 ISO, wide open aperture, and 1/8 of a second. That is the fastest I could get out of it without blurring the whole scenery because the Ferris wheel keeps moving. And you see that the cars are almost frozen. They're just blurred a tiny little bit, 1/8 of a second. Click. That's the shot I get. And then, of course, if you have observation platforms, that's a good thing. This is the clock tower in Boston. I showed you an example early on for a unique angle, unique vantage point, again, with star trails in the sky. And this is the Empire State Building in New York. They do not allow you to take a tripod up there, but you can take a little gorilla pod. Put that in your bag and wrap that around the banister to hold your camera in place. I talked a little bit about composition to make it look interesting, and the same compositional rules apply for night photography, right? The rule of thirds, leading line, subject matter, interest and impact. So here's the rule of thirds, and you see that the brightest part of the image is right here in that 1/3 node, right? And I have a really strong leading line going in here, some interesting puddles in the foreground. So there's a foreground, a middle ground, and the background is a nice sky. And I take advantage of that. So all of that is still the same. But there are a couple of things that are unique for night photography. One, and of course, the same as for daytime photography, don't just document something. Find a unique angle, create a story or an emotion or something interesting, right? Tell a story. Two things that are unique for night photography. One is you have really bright lights, and that's something you don't have to deal with during the day, but at night you can have really bright lights, so don't put them right at the edge. And as I mentioned before, if you can't avoid them, make them a feature, put them right in the middle of the composition. But if they are right at the edge, like here, they just distract, because the human eye tends to go to the brightest part in the image, and that is that bright light on the edge. So I'm kind of not showcasing the blue bridge that I wanted to showcase, but my eye goes to the yellow light. So what I did in post-processing is crop that out, if you can't avoid it. Now you are seeing the blue light and those beautiful shadows here, and here's a bright light that I'm showcasing as part of the composition, an abandoned factory here on the left. So really cool stuff, right? And the other effect is that your motion that you capture, the element of time, might actually add to the composition. And in this case, the star trails are pointing at the unique architecture that I wanted to showcase. And that actually happens to be the venting of the tunnel going underneath Boston, right? So it's an industrial setting, nice building, nice interesting architecture, and the star trails are pointing right at it. So I use that as an advantage for the composition. Let's talk a little bit about editing. And of course, why do we edit photos? So one is that raw files come out of camera fairly flat, and they need a little bit of editing. If you shoot JPEGs, they look very different from raw file because JPEGs are highly processed images, right? But also JPEGs throw away 80% of the information by compressing the hell out of it and not allowing you to make any adjustments. So here's a scenery that I shot, and I already zoomed into 70 millimeters. That's as far as I could zoom in, as close as I could get to that scenery. So I have this super bright light here at the edge. I was aware of that. I also caught a little bit of the rail down here. But what I wanted to showcase is this. But it looks kind of flat, kind of misty, milky, right? And the histogram showed me that I'm properly exposing. Nothing is clipping, including that bright light, except for the street light here, of course. Right? And then after editing, I cropped it in. I cropped out the bright light on the right. I cropped out a rail on the bottom left. And this is what I wanted to showcase. So these, what they call crepuscular rays, are coming out of the city, which is really cool effect. And they are right on the 1/3 line. So I'm using the rule of thirds. 1/3 water and 2/3 the rest. So it's a nice sectioning of the image. Good composition, but I had to process it to give it real blacks in the shadows and real brights in the highlights. And the clarity gives you the nice contrast to make the image pop. Here's another example. One of my favorite things to visit is what I call a gravel yard. These are essentially quarries that smash up rocks to make sand and gravel, right? And then they separate the fine gravel from the coarse gravel and build these mounds. It's a wonderful location. Of course, you are not supposed to be in there at night, but they all happen to be wide open at night. I don't know why. So I just keep finding myself wandering inside. And I light painted the foreground a little bit, but you don't really see that. So flat out of camera, and then after processing, boom, it looks like that. And some clarity makes it pop. I have the cloud streaks coming right at me. It makes it very, very dynamic, right? And then that beautiful texture in the foreground from the trucks backing in. So that was a very nice scenery there. And then the darker it gets, the worse it gets with being flat. So here is something that you don't find in the city, but just to illustrate you that on a really dark image, everything becomes really, really muddy, and you have to process the hell out of it to make it look intriguing. Yeah? Coming back to white balance, I mentioned that auto doesn't work and daylight doesn't work either. So this is how a night scene looks if you shoot at daylight setting or the sunny setting. It becomes totally warm because it thinks there is no light, and then it adjusts it somehow based on some algorithm that doesn't work at night. This is what happens if you shoot on auto white balance. It becomes totally blue. The exact opposite, right? And this is how the scenery should be looking like, with fairly neutral grays everywhere, a little bit of blue in the sky, and also some warm reds and warm yellows everywhere. Unfortunately, they make presets for sunny, cloudy shade, but they don't make presets for civil twilight, nautical twilight, and night. I wish they would, because that would be a real good addition. Then the second most common mistake is overexposure. So if you find yourself taking a photo like this, that is way underexposed, and you can tell by this gap here in the histogram. If you have a gap like this that goes to the first line, you are 2 or 3 stops underexposed. And in that case, just take it again. Now open the aperture, go to longer exposure time. This is what you want. Right? You want to stretch the histogram all the way out until you see a few clipping highlights, and that's the sacrificial highlights that we talked about. And then start editing it. This is the final edit of that image. And here's the burnt out house. And to answer somebody else's question, again, is it safe to go there? This was right on the road. So we didn't have to go through any fences. You could just walk in. So we just walked up to it. I didn't go inside because it was structurally compromised inside for sure. But I did take a few photos through the windows of the inside and light painted it from another window. But this is how I took it. And if you think this is overexposed and looks more like an underexposed afternoon, you are absolutely right. But what I exposed for was this white facade, the little bit left over vinyl here on the side. I did not want to clip that. And the histogram showed me that everything is properly exposed, and I'm utilizing the entire dynamic range. I'm exposing from all black to all white, and I'm not wasting any of that. Now, if I process that, what I do is I reduce the exposure, I add some clarity to it, and kaboom, that's it. Cropped it in a little bit from the side, right? But if you look at the histogram, now that dynamic range is shorter. But what I did was I used the entire dynamic range of the camera and then just compressed it into a smaller space by reducing the exposure. I'm not losing anything. I can pull that right back out, right? But if you underexpose like that, you would be losing all of the highlights, and that is a big difference. So if you can do it, expose like that. Expose all the way to the right. There's no super bright light in here, so it's really easy to do that. And then reduce the exposure in post-processing and do your creative thing. A lot of impact on this image. Then there is that trade-off between shadows and highlights, and I mentioned early on that that is really the art of urban night photography, to find that spot to push the exposure as much as you can without clipping too many highlights. So in this scenery, I was exposing for those lights right here on the water. I did not want to clip them, realizing that that light clips, and I'm pushing it really, really close on that light here. After processing, it looks like that. And the way I approach that is like this. This is scenery. I shot that from a bridge. I was eye to eye with the building, and I exposed it for the brightest lights right here in the middle, and those right here. So that is how far you can push the exposure, because I did not want to clip the windows, but everything else is almost black, totally underexposed. Now, the first step in post-processing is to reduce the highlights. Really bright highlights. You reduce the highlights, and now everything's underexposed, right? And then you push the overall exposure and bring it all back. And then you can add some clarity. And this is the histogram that I got from the raw file. I was pushing all the way to the right, nothing is clipping. But there's a lot of shadow material here, and that is all of the dark stuff that you see, right? I reduce the highlights, and then I push the overall exposure. Boom, that's it. And then you push the shadows a little more. You can see that there's no highlight clipping here, there's no highlight clipping here, and that is what I was exposing for. But I brought back all of that shadow information that was all around there, okay? Last example, the Boston Waterfront, very iconic scenery to shoot. What I exposed for were the brightest lights right here in that archway. I didn't want to blow that out. The rest is somewhat underexposed, a little too warm also in white balance. I corrected for that and cut off the airplane trail on the right. That's the scenery. And you see that I'm not clipping a whole lot of lights here. You can see the archway with a yellow light and all of the rest of the city. And you see some texture in the sky as well that you didn't really see before. So there is some processing that you need to do. Part of that processing, I mentioned that a lot of streetlights get replaced with LED lights. And the problem with these LED lights is they have a green tint. You don't really realize that with your human eyes because you know it. We don't distinguish colors very well at night. But they are green. You see that the pavement is really green here, and the reflection on the water is really green because this light here is really green. And the way I correct for that is a single slider in Lightroom or Camera Raw. You go into the color section and the hue section, and you push that green slider to the left. That is the anti-LED green slider, as I call it, right? So now you see that the pavement is just yellow, not green anymore, and the green in the water is toned down a little bit, right? So that is a single adjustment that you can do to get rid of that icky green from LED lights. All right, we're coming to the end. If you can remember four things, shoot at low ISO. It doesn't have to be 100, but don't go over 400, right? And shoot at small apertures because they give you nice starbursts, and they give you low ISO, low noise, and they give you smooth waters and all of that, right? And try to maximize the exposure time exposed to the right. And that means you have sacrificial highlights, you have desired highlights, and you have to make that trade-off. How far can I push it? And again, take a few images, take 3 images, one that you think is too dark, one that you think is too bright, one that you think is right. And then in post-processing, you will see where you can recover the highlights and the shadows best. And over time, you get a feeling for that, and you know how bright, how much you can push it. Use your RGB histogram. It's an extremely useful tool, all right? And don't use auto white balance. It does not work at night, I guarantee you. Use the Kelvin scale and make sure that the LCD preview looks like the scenery that you're looking at, right? Not all yellow and not all blue. And then finally, go to all those mundane places that you don't think are very interesting at night. You might find something that is really, really interesting. Here is Fort Worth in Texas, a really boring city, I have to tell you, but I did find an abandoned building, and again, to the question earlier, the door was open. I went inside, and I found a broken window, and I shot the skyline of Fort Worth through that broken window. Perfect combination. Huh? I'll leave you with a few resources here. The best book really to get is Lance Kymek's Finding Your Way in the Dark, for night photography and light painting. Lance was the person who taught me night photography, and eventually I took over that course and started teaching it myself. But that book is very comprehensive and the best resource that you can have. Gabe Biederman, Tim Cooper have a book, Night Photography from Snapshots to Great Shots, which is more for the absolute beginner. And then, of course, there is my website. I think Joe will distribute the speaker notes from tonight. You can also find them on my website. Go to the educational section and you can download the PDF. And then there's my blog, and that has deep dives into various topics. And if you go on to your favorite social media, just search for night photography and you'll find a lot of inspiration there, right? I am online in many places. I have a website, a blog, Facebook, LinkedIn, Flickr, Instagram. And if you don't want to remember all of those links, just remember linktree/JM Lobert, linktr.ee/JM Lobert. You get all of those links. And the one that I'd like to highlight just before I finish out is my Patreon. Patreon is a crowdfunding site. You can support artists through that, and you can support me for as little as $2. You get to tap into more than 150 posts that I've created since 2019, and I keep doing that on a weekly basis. I would love to see some of you. There are equipment reviews, in-depth editing techniques, and lots of photos, how I took them, where I took them, and what to do, what not to do. Lots of advice, right? Would love to see you there. And with that, Carpe Noctem, let's seize the night. Thank you very much for listening. And oh, look, more bucket lists. What do you know?
Jürgen, thank you so much. That was an absolutely, as I said to you earlier, an excellent presentation, and you filled the bill. That was great.
Thank you.
We have 53 people. While we're doing this, if you can unmute yourself for a second, that would be great, everybody. We have 53 participants tonight in the session, and that's a really high number for us. That's great. So I want everybody to give Jürgen a real thank you. If you can clap.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you.
That was great.
That's actually a good practice that you have there, to have everybody unmute and clap. One thing on Zoom is the feedback. When I crack a joke, nobody laughs. Did they find that funny or not?
Thanks a lot, Jürgen.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. Just remember, everybody, next Monday night is a
couple of questions that I see in the chat. Is do you use HDR at night to help with some of the highlights? Rarely, but yes, sometimes I do. If it's a really contrasty scene, I do sometimes do HDR, but I prefer to do single images. And I found during the day I don't really do it anymore because I can push the shadows as I need. But at nighttime, it sometimes helps. So definitely go for it. And the stable tripod is the secret here. Now, one other question. What is the drawback to using shutter priority mode for night photography? You don't really want to leave the decision to the camera what shutter and aperture to use. So you really want to control that. You want to tell the camera low ISO, the aperture that I want to use, and then figure out what the exposure time is. In most cases, the camera will not do a good job stretching the histogram out. So it might give you an okay image, but it's probably underexposed or overexposed. And then the last one, do you ever use photo pills to figure out the equivalent exposures? No, I do not use apps because my high ISO preview will give you the exact setting that you need. Remember 6400 ISO, how many seconds do I need? And that becomes the number of minutes at ISO 100. And that is for the actual scenery that you're shooting, and it gives you the exact exposure that you need. Any app will need a starting point. So you will need to tell the app, okay, during the day, this would be 1/250th of a second. What is it at night? And then I guarantee you're not going to be spot on with any kind of app. Don't bother. The high ISO preview mode takes you the same amount of time as it does to pull up the menu. Where's my app? Here's the app. So now which aperture? Way too long. Don't bother.
All right. Okay.
Any other questions?
I did want to mention before everybody signs off that next Monday night is an image review, and Lori Snyder is going to be doing that. And the theme is peeling paint. And you need to have your entries in by Thursday evening. for that image review next week. And if
And
Karen,
of
is
course,
on-
here's
go ahead.
here's a suggestion for the peeling paint. Do that at night. Use your flashlight and paint the peeling paint to create shadows. Looks
Okay,
really
well,
good.
that's a cool idea. Thank you. That was great. Okay, and
One track mind.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Any final comments for anybody before we sign off? Again, thank you so much, Jürgen. We really appreciated it. So Karen's going to take us out next Wednesday night, and with all these tips and tricks we got in our head, we're gonna really give her a run for the money. So thank you.
If you post them anywhere, let me know where. I might
Okay.
comment on it. Thanks for having me. Appreciate
Okay,
it.
thank you.
Terrific
Good night.
presentation.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.